Welcome back to a new episode of Speaking Tongues. I'm here today with Dani. Dani James is a native New Yorker who grew up in Belgium speaking French, Flemish, and English. Her translation of Return to the Place I Never Left, a survival memoir by Tobias Schiff, is a 2025 National Jewish Book Award winner and a Wayne State University Press bestselling book. The book and translation were praised as a literary discovery. She has appeared on the Creative Pen podcast and Translators Aloud and teaches workshops about writing, translation, and multilingualism. She's a CUNY alumni 50 Under 50 award recipient, works in technology, and loves music. And Dani, I'm so happy to have you here today on the podcast. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you. I'm very happy to be here and really looking forward to our conversation today.
Same. I am too. I'm really excited about this. And I like to start each episode with the same question, which is what is your first language and which languages have you learned to speak?
Yes, thank you. So my first language is French, actually. I was born in New York City. My mom is Jewish, my father is Jamaican. And then I moved to Belgium when I was just a toddler. And so my mom spoke French to me. So that was the main language I spoke at home. But then my dad's side of the family spoke English with me. So I grew up speaking both French and English within the home, French being the little bit more of the main language. But then because I lived in Belgium, in the northern part of Belgium, in Antwerp, where we speak Flemish, all of my education and the going language outside was Flemish. So Flemish is a language I picked up quite early once I started kindergarten. And it is the language right now. It's a language that will never leave me. Whenever I do math and any type of difficult math I have to do in my head, I've noticed that I default to Flemish because that's the language that I learned to do math in
Yeah.
officially.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's so
Yeah.
cool. That's crazy because one thing I love about language is numbers and how we always default to like the language that we learn to do math in or the language that we learn numbers in. Because even when I am trying to learn French, I told you this before, I'm very much a learner of the French language and other languages. But when I get to a number, I just say it in English and it takes me so long to like, oh wait, I have to say this number in another language. So that's really cool.
Yeah, thank you. I know numbers are really tough. I would say, I've picked up a little bit of Spanish along the way later in life, which is one of the languages that I've learned, and some other languages as well that I heard growing up. Like I grew up around Yiddish and Patois, which is like English, but not every English speaker necessarily understands Patois well, as well as some Hebrew. And so I've noticed that in the languages where numbers are very different from a language I already know, I
Mhm.
have to count. So if I'm saying the number eight, for example, I have to go one, two, three, four, in the language that I know before I can say the number eight. And whereas if it's Spanish, which is actually quite close to French,
Mhm.
I know how to say eight because it's quite similar and almost begins with the same sound. And
Mhm.
so then I don't have to think about it too much. But any other language, I'm in my head. One, two, three, four, six, seven, eight.
Yes. Yes, always counting on my fingers when it comes
Yes.
to numbers in other languages. So you had this very multilingual upbringing in a multilingual environment in a multilingual country. Talk to us a bit about what that dynamic was like.
It was amazing. I haven't really, I didn't reflect on it or realize any of it and how meaningful it would be, or
Mhm.
how meaningful it would turn out in my life later also. Because, when you're growing up, things just are the way they are. And so for me, it was very normal. Thankfully, also Belgium is by nature a multilingual country where there is more than one official language. So as I mentioned, the northern part speaks Flemish as the official language. The southern part speaks French. In the middle, there's a mix of both. And then there's a sliver next to the German border that speaks German. And so what ends up happening is when you're in school, when you're around 11 years old, depending on which part you live in, you start to learn the language of the other part. So people naturally typically speak both languages quite well or can get by in both languages. But then on top of that, the neighborhood where I grew up was also a neighborhood where we had a lot of people from Morocco and Nigeria, Senegal, Congo. And so you also absorb the languages of your neighborhood. So I feel really grateful now, especially having been back in New York for over a decade now. Whenever I hear a language, I find that I can and find my way quite well with people from different languages. Or when I meet someone, oh, you're from here, I can say two, three words. And that's all thanks to not just the country, but also very specifically the neighborhood that I grew up in addition to the family that I grew up in as well. And so when I was younger, I didn't really think of it. This is just
Yeah.
how it is. The slang in Antwerp of my neighborhood specifically will include mainly Flemish, but it will also include some English words, some French words, some Arabic words, sometimes a little bit of Lingala. So it's just a big mix, and you learn to just understand these expressions. And it's something that I really come to appreciate now, especially being in the US and being able to communicate with so many people, but also seeing the different dynamics where, in the US, there's a big emphasis on speaking English and there's
Mm.
some friction sometimes, when people speak other languages. And I believe this year English has been made the official language of the US, or there's been some
Mhm.
advocacy by some politicians to make it so. And it's unfortunate because I've really come to appreciate a place that's so multilingual because it shifts how it opens up different ways of communicating,
Yeah.
not just within ourselves, but also with other people.
Hmm. Absolutely. Tell us, do you have any examples of what that kind of neighborhood slang sounded like?
Okay, I'm gonna try something. I don't know if it'll make sense, but for example, if you see something crazy, you'll be like, and you want to tell somebody, you'll be like, "Ouais, je te jure, j'ai vu ça. Dat was echt gestoord. Niet normaal, echt zot." So this is only two languages that I used. That was French and Flemish, but the first part of it was, I swear, in French, and then I saw something that really wasn't normal. It's crazy. Actually, now something new that has happened. When I grew up, and something was crazy, you would say, "Oh, that's crazy." In Flemish, we would say, "Das echt zot," which means that's really crazy.
Mhm.
And now what I've noticed, there's a shift in both Belgium and France where people will say the English word crazy. So people will say that's crazy.
What?
Yes, and this is a newer phenomenon I've observed. So now when I say zot instead of crazy, I sound a little bit outdated. And I'm back there.
Oh man, that's crazy.
Yeah.
But yeah, language, I think English, I've noticed people say that English is kind of creeping in to I've heard French speakers say that English is creeping in a lot of different slang, and there's different attitudes toward that, and it's I guess it's also happening in Flemish also.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yes. And I will say in Belgium, the difference between Belgium and France, when you look at the TV shows we used to watch. So we used to have a lot of American TV shows and still do have a lot of American and English TV shows on television there. And while in France they would be dubbed into the French language, in Belgium they would remain in English and we would have subtitles. So
Oh.
people in Belgium have always been so used to hearing English, and I think by the time that people in Belgium are teenagers, typically, if they've grown up there watching TV, they know how to understand and speak English pretty well. But I've noticed that it starts even younger now because cartoons for children used to be dubbed. And so they would either be in Flemish or in French. But now with the rise of YouTube Kids, I'm really impressed at my friends' children because sometimes I see them, I think, how are they speaking English fluent already? Are they taking English courses? And it's all YouTube Kids and the content they see online that's fully in English.
So at what point was it for you that, you're surrounded by so many languages and it's normal, like you said, this is your life. Um, what was the point where you realized that you wanted to move into making a craft or making a profession out of translating language?
I never intentionally became a translator. I never thought about it. one of the funny things that people used to tell me my whole life, once they understood that I spoke a few language fluently, people always said, "Oh, you can get any job you want. Oh my goodness, you could work for the UN." It's funny because my whole life I've heard these things, and I've never worked for the UN, and I've thankfully been gainfully employed, but I never thought about it as really this at the time, this thing that could unlock anything I wanted to do. But I am a writer. I'm a writer. I'm a creative writer. And so when I had picked up back writing again, I started writing when I was really young, then stopped because that also was not considered a real profession. As many creative professions are, they're not seen as stable. So a lot of times,
Right.
when you're younger, you're somewhat discouraged from pursuing that,
Hmm.
even if not intentionally. But I picked it back up in college, which I did in the US. And
Hmm.
so I'd started writing already, and I was writing short stories and working on larger projects. And later got an MFA in creative writing. And before that, there was this book that I had been reading since I was a teenager. And the book is titled Return to the Place I Never Left by Tobias Schiff. And that's the book I ended up translating. And this book is originally written in Flemish. And it's a story about a Holocaust survivor who was from Belgium, and he was also deported from Belgium. And my grandparents were Holocaust survivors. So this is a topic that my family was immersed in. It's that side of my family is really small because most of the people did not survive the Holocaust. So I always had a very small side of the family on my mom's side, and obviously we know why because my grandmother is of the generation that went through and survived the war,
Okay.
and so I'm only two generations further. So
Right.
these are the stories we know. They're part of my family history. And when I read Return to the Place I Never Left, it's really unique in how it was written because it's written in verse, because it started from an oral testimony. And so when you read this book, it really seems as if Schiff is talking to you directly or he's speaking to himself, and you're able to be there as a witness or someone listening to his story. And so this writing style really stood out to me and captured just my attention. And also the fact that he describes certain things really well, very direct. Again, because this was later in his life, and he was saying these things. The first version was based on a transcript of him giving testimony.
Hmm.
And this book was so powerful that every few years I reread it. I love to reread books that I love. My favorites, I've read them at least 5 times. The good thing is I have bad movie and book memory, so I will forget whole plots. It's not, when I'm rereading it, it feels new again, and I always
Right.
discover new parts.
Yeah.
So, Return to the Place I Never Left, the Flemish version, was a book that I kept coming back to every few years. And every time I was impressed by it again. And so at some point, the book was in my mom's home in Belgium still, and I had moved back to New York already. At some point, I brought it back to New York with me, and I thought it deserved a wider audience. And so before I started my MFA program in creative writing, I had a meeting with the director of the program, and I asked him, "Do you have a translation course? Because I don't have any formal experience. I just know how to speak these languages, but I
Hmm.
really think this book deserves a wider audience." And so they didn't have a translation course, but they did very much encourage me to pursue this project. And so I completed my first draft of the translation, having no experience, no formal translation experience other than knowing the languages, back in 2020, as part of finalizing my MFA program. And so that was ultimately unofficially or officially. I just didn't realize it at the time, when I became a translator, and it wasn't something I'd intentionally thought about other than the excitement about this book and
Hmm.
how powerful I found it, and the
Hmm.
thought that from both of a content and form way, I think people would really appreciate it. And I can't just keep this to myself. It's, who reads Flemish in the world? Not many people. And
Right.
I think English speakers would really enjoy this as well. And so that's thankfully been the case. And I must say, whereas initially I hadn't even thought about translation as a profession, now I'm so excited about it because I've learned so much, and I start to appreciate language and my experiences and the experiences of the world so much more. And also translation is far more creative than I would have imagined it to be.
Mm.
Because when we think about creativity, we think likely the ultimate creative act is to generate our own material, right? But translation's biggest challenge is effectively transferring a meaning from one language to the other, which requires a lot of creative work still while adhering to these words that someone else wrote, and you want to preserve them and you want to honor them and you want to keep their meaning. But as you know, because you've had so many guests on this podcast also who talk about the differences in language, and you don't have a one-to-one translation for many
Hmm.
words. And so it becomes a really challenging but fun creative challenge to steward a story from one language to the next in a way that allows the new readers to also experience the same emotion and the same experience when they read as if they
Yeah.
were reading the original.
Yeah. So what initially drew you to this story? I mean, there are many, I don't want to say so many or an abundance of, but there are many people who have written or told their experience from the Holocaust as survivors of the Holocaust. What was it specifically about this story that drew you in from the beginning?
Yeah, let me show you really quickly what it looks like on the page. So first is its form. So it's a written in verse, and that's a very unique form for a memoir, but one that works really, really well for this. So I hope you can see, but I don't know if you can see. This does not look like your typical prose. You have quite short sentences here. There's no punctuation other than question marks and exclamation points, and that ends up making the language really direct.
Right.
And so it creates this experience that when you're reading this book, again, it's like you're in conversation with Tobias Schiff, or you're right there with him. As you know, he sometimes isn't sure if he effectively remembers something. So he'll say, "Oh, my mother was there," or "Was she? Was she still there? I'm not sure." And he talks about how over the years, his memory sometimes he can't see moments clearly,
Mm.
although there are other moments that he sees more and more clearly, right? And
Hmm.
that won't moments he can't shake, even if he would want to. So there's a directness to this language that makes the text really accessible in a way, and also really engaging
Hmm.
because it's a really heavy topic, and he goes through multiple concentration camps. He's deported when he's 17 and then goes through 8 camps, including work camps, death camps, loses all his close family members. It's really it's horrific. It's devastating. And something about the way that the text is on the page, it doesn't weigh down what is already a really heavy topic.
Hmm.
You might still need to pause when you read it, but it allows you to reflect. There's a lot of white space that allows the content and you as a reader to pause sometimes and to breathe. And he has a section where he talks about hunger
Hmm.
and the impact of being constantly starved and what that does to the mind.
Right.
And he describes hunger as a beast. And so there's this rich imagery where he envisions this monster that's clawing through your insides and
Hmm.
scratching at you, you know, when you
Hmm.
feel those sharp hunger pangs. And so he has a lot of moments like that that really helps the text stand out through the imagery, through the language that he uses. And it's not that long, because even though, the book has looks like a regular sized book, and it is, again, the sentences are short and direct.
Yeah.
And so you're able, you read it and it's intense, but you're really brought into the story, and you get a firsthand account, which is really important as well,
Hmm.
um, of what actually happened. And those are some of the things that really stood out. The section on hunger is one that stands out, and that a lot of people say stands out for them as well. And it's interesting because that was one that stood out for me when I was younger
Yeah.
as well. So rich imagery, even while the language is not uh, language that is flowery or meant to be flowery at all.
Hmm. So this is a huge responsibility to translate a topic that's so heavy, so painful for the Jewish community, for the community of survivors of the Holocaust, um, and such a devastating, dark period in world history. And like you said yourself, two generations removed from this atrocity, right? So you already have this connection personally, and you have Tobias's words that have been so instrumental and so touching to you personally in your life. So this is a huge responsibility to do this kind of work. How did that feel to you, and how did that responsibility even show up in the process of creating this translation?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Initially I didn't I was just enthusiastic about the text, right? And so you undertake a project like this, so you just start you start translating. But then there come some sections where you realize that in Belgium, what in English language oftentimes we'll refer to as Nazis, the overarching term. They had specific divisions and specific, people who had specific tasks. So SS is one of the SS people are the people who, also ran the camps. And so they in Flemish or in the original, that's a term that's often used throughout the book. Um, but I realized that, okay, this book came out in 2025. It's also in a different country. Not everyone is as familiar with those terms as the people at the time and the place in which this book was written. And so I had to make decisions sometimes to decide, okay, what do I do? Do I explain the text or explain what something is through a footnote, which I've done. I included a few translators' notes to give additional context
Mhm.
to help the new readers understand what the context is, as well as just think about how are the new readers going to receive this and how will it make sense to them based on where we are today. So there are certain decisions you have to think about to make sure that it's well represented and that the meaning is not missed, not just with the words, but also, yeah, sometimes you might need a little bit of extra clarification. And
Mhm.
then are you able to do that within the text itself, or does it require a little footnote because it would deviate too much from the original
Right,
text?
right.
So those are the decisions the sort of craft decisions you make as a translator when thinking about responsibly translating a firsthand testimony, firsthand experience of someone who also is no longer alive. That's another layer to this, is that Tobias Schiff has passed away. He passed away a few years after his book was originally published in Flemish, so he hasn't seen the republication and the further translation in French and now to English.
Mhm.
Um, and so you also want to honor those words and
Yeah.
and honor the original text and the person who wrote them. And then in addition to all that, there are fewer and fewer Holocaust survivors still alive. And so, I'm very grateful that I've been able to preserve this story and I've been able to contribute to preserving these stories because memoirs really have the opportunity to help us understand one another, right? And we're becoming so polarized as a world, and it's easy to dismiss a whole group, easier to dismiss a group than a person who you're in conversation with. Memoirs still have that opportunity to help us learn from experiences and people who we might not have been able to interact with or might not really understand much about. And so I feel really grateful that I've been able to contribute to keeping this history alive through this book. I think naturally as a translator, we care deeply about effectively bringing the words to the new reader,
Mhm.
um, and effectively conveying the meaning and the emotion. And so, whether that has to do with this topic or another, ultimately that's the goal and a responsibility I think every translator is really concerned with.
Yeah, I love that answer because I'm so fascinated by translation as an art and translation in general because there's I think there's something that I had to learn, that it's not one to one. It's not just saying, this means that, and that's exactly what you need to put on the page to make people understand, because there's a whole lot of nuance and so much that can be said in one language, but it really means this, or it carries an undertone of something else in a completely different language. So I'm saying that to say I think the work that translators do is like alchemy. I think it's magic, and I think it's really so special um to have this skill set to be able to do that. And you know, there are all kinds of translators out there and all kinds of literary works out there. So working with something that has such a personal meaning as far as your family history, but also that carries so much weight in the world at large into how people, um, view something through the lens of history. It's a lot. So, I know that you took this on with such great care, and that's really special.
To your point, also, becoming a translator has made me think also about all the stories we haven't been able to read yet because they haven't been translated. And so it feels like sometimes I feel, oh, imagine all the pieces that have maybe gotten lost over time, that haven't been digitized and we haven't been able to read them. And on one hand, it can feel a little sad to realize we're missing so many stories of people all over the world,
Mhm.
but there's also a huge opportunity. And I've been even toying with the idea of exploring some French poetry or other pieces from countries where people haven't been translated as much. Several African countries speak French. And so I'm curious about the literary canon that exists there that maybe hasn't really been translated as much, and really interested in potentially doing some work like that later. But just the thought of, languages that aren't really spoken in the world, it takes a translator to then
Right.
decide to translate it and bring it into a new language. And then on top of that, it requires a publisher to be interested and
Yeah.
there's a whole mechanism behind it for it to actually find new life in a new place.
Mhm.
But it makes me really excited about the opportunity for us to learn about things that we haven't even about people, places, and experiences that we haven't really gotten a chance to read from.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. I think about that a lot. And going back to what you said before about people reading in Flemish and people may not be reading in Flemish on a large scale, it makes me think a lot about who decides who gets to be translated and what gets to come to, you know, an English speaking country. And I think a lot about hierarchy. I think a lot about fairness. I think a lot about what's behind these decisions and who gets to call the shots. And like, to your point, whose words do we get to read? And I always think that there's not enough uh translated works, but like you said, it takes somebody to have the willingness and the desire and the ability and the skill to be able to translate that in the first place. So where's everybody at? Because I want to read more stories from all over the world and in places where, you know, I may not have an opportunity to find a book in Flemish or learn to read Flemish, but it doesn't mean I don't wanna know about the stories of the people, like, in your neighborhood where you grew up in Antwerp. I'm sure there's so many stories that could be told,
yes.
and you know, somebody like you could be the difference of that person getting their story out to a wider audience. So I think about that maybe a little bit too much.
Yeah.
About, whose story gets to be on the bookshelves, you know?
Yes, yes. I'm right with you there on, just with the desire of reading more stories. And to your point, who gets to choose it. It takes so many different there's so many moving parts to this. And when we look at certain books, there are several books that have been translated multiple times, right? Many times, and that get retranslated over time, some of the classics, some of the bestsellers. And so this is also quite interesting because some translations might be award-winning translations. You could have 10 translations of the same book and no two of them will be the same, which is also really, really interesting to me
Yeah,
because
yeah.
no two people would approach translating something the same way. But also, yes, and especially in today's book markets, right? People are just naturally reading less. They're showing that, the people who have read a full novel, I think even in a year, is just declining. Um, so the literary landscape is becoming a little bit more challenging.
Hmm.
Though it's there, it's still, it still exists, and we
There's
still have
hope.
readers like you and I. Yes. Um, and we don't know what the future looks like, right? I also very much am very hopeful still. But yeah, a lot of decisions go into who and what gets translated. And while there are some official mechanics, right? If a new book comes out and it does well, then typically they'll look to expand it in other markets, and then the translator is, commissioned. But when it comes to the stories that we're thinking about, right,
Hmm.
the stories that haven't really been told, I think right now it really relies on individuals or perhaps some organizations to make those decisions, where it's more so people who come across the text and then think, wow, this deserves a wider audience. Or maybe have the intention of, I want to preserve some of the stories that
Hmm.
are of this culture, and
Yeah.
then taking it on themselves, which was my approach. And it's a little bit of a different one. You translate it first, and then you have to go find a home for it, which is not always guaranteed, a publisher home for it.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, let's hope that, we that people and writers around the world will are willing to take this on, because it does, you know, in addition to understanding the language, you have, being proficient in at least the language you're writing in, but also the original, because you need to effectively translate it. You also do have to be a good writer, because you have to be able to re-represent the meaning effectively in a new language. It's exciting to think of the potential, and at the same time also it can sadden us, because we know there's so many stories that may never get translated and we might not
Yeah.
hear.
Tell me about the author, Tobias Schiff. Tell me about his experience. Okay, I might be digging a little too far into this, but his experience during the Holocaust. What language, what languages was he speaking while he was in these camps?
Yes, actually, thank you for that question. I'm looking at my book, because I'm going to pick it up and read a very short page for you in a moment. But this is something that I think also people don't necessarily realize. I also didn't think about this growing up. This was not necessarily a detail that was,
Yeah.
that was talked about in my family, not intentionally. But when you think about the people who ended up in the camps, they were from countries all over Europe, countries
Right.
and communities all over Europe.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so they had, and in Europe, they speak many different languages. Yet the people who ran the camps spoke German. And so oftentimes you had a dynamic where people couldn't communicate effectively,
Mm.
right? The prisoners very quickly learned to understand the commands that were barked at them constantly. Um, but there were a lot of people who spoke Polish in the camps, prisoners as well, including Polish citizens who weren't Jewish. Um, and then German was, of course, spoken by the people who ran the camps. But then the prisoners spoke all types of languages. And so for Tobias Schiff, he was born in Poland and then grew up in Antwerp. And so he spoke Yiddish at home, and Yiddish is heavily influenced by German, Polish, amongst other languages. And so, and then Schiff, because he also grew up in Belgium, he also spoke French and Flemish.
Hmm.
And so this knowledge of languages, multiple languages, including Yiddish, because it had these heavy German and Polish influences, proved at times life-saving to him in the camps,
Hmm.
because he was able to respond sometimes in perfect or near perfect German to the
Mm.
guards.
Hmm.
And he describes a scene in which that sometimes in a split second potentially jarred them, because so many people couldn't necessarily respond. And so the guards were taught to see, this is what Schiff says in one of the pages, they were taught to see the prisoners as less than human,
Mm.
right? And so, but sometimes those people, he actually uses the word vermin. They were taught to see us as vermin, but sometimes that vermin speaks their language. And so when you have someone who suddenly says something back to you in your language
Yeah.
and says it perfectly, in a flash, sometimes it kind of causes them to stumble and think, okay, you know. So he was able to leverage this sometimes to his advantage. And leverage is a strong word because he's still a Jewish prisoner in a labor or death camp. So he has no leverage ultimately. But there are small moments where he is able to act quite bravely, risking his life sometimes, um, where his languages have helped him. And so I'm going to read one page to you, if that's okay, because you might
Yeah.
actually also recognize some of these languages, and I'll read it to you, and then we can discuss.
Okay.
So this is when he's in Bergen-Belsen, and they're about to, this is towards, the Allies are moving in closer, so they're liquidating all the concentration camps, bringing them all into Bergen-Belsen, and um, it's becoming really hectic, and there are more and more and more prisoners together from all different places.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so, okay. Once an SS officer asked which one of us knew languages. Here's a paper. Write down all the languages you know. They needed translators because the convoys burst in from everywhere. Camps from all corners of Europe were being evacuated. I wrote the languages I knew: French, Flemish, Belgian, Walloon, Dutch, Hollands, Luxembourgish, Yiddish, Hebrew, English, German, Polish, Russian, Aramaic. I had a list of 13 or 14 languages. For Belgium alone, I had 5 or 6. Where did I find the audacity? In a flash, I thought, in front of me sits a God who knows everything. Across from him, a nobody stands. He who is and knows everything, his knowledge lives in his gun. He won't lower himself by asking a nobody a question like, what is Walloon? Thus admitting he doesn't know something. The SS guard didn't know the words Walloon or Hollands. I was chosen. So in this example, I'm sure you noticed, like he said, he is making up some languages,
Right.
right? So he goes French, Flemish. He says Flemish, then he says Dutch, then he says Hollands, which all refer to the same language, basically. Then he also says Belgian, which is not a language, you know, because
Mm-hmm.
he says Walloon. So he uses this moment to then leverage, you know, okay, he knows these languages. He throws in some more, assuming the guard is not going to know. And that's really risky because if the guard would have known, that could have meant the end of his life.
Right.
And so, yeah, this one shows you how how his brain worked and how he operated sometimes, um, in a way that was able to save him and sometimes his friends in the camps. I think that's a good example also of, and you know, the languages that he knew, and then the languages he was able to leverage and claim that he knew based on the languages he knew, which were mixed sometimes with different languages,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
Yiddish.
Wow. That's so strategic to
Yes.
think fast enough to do that. And I'm asking that question, and I I'm not really that ashamed about exposing my ignorance on the show because I don't know what I don't know, and I'm not shy about asking. And I think people should always ask when they don't know
Yes.
something. But I never even thought about how many that there were people from all over Europe who were affected by the Holocaust, and people who were put into camps and put into these horrific situations and terrorized. But I guess it never occurred to me like how many languages that people are speaking, and people who don't know the other language, they might not necessarily, like someone from Poland may not necessarily know French or
Yes. Yeah.
Dutch or something like that. And there was this whole mix. And I guess I'm talking this out in my head as I'm realizing it now, but
Yeah, because there's a huge communication barrier
yeah.
among the people who are in the same position as prisoners,
Mhm.
as well as with the guards, the people who are guarding them. So yeah, I think this is also a detail that I never really, you don't really think about it, right? And it's not necessarily the first detail that people mention. There's so many other things
Right.
um, of a greater magnitude to discuss, but it does play into the dynamics of how people were or were not able to maneuver or even uh, collaborate, right, and get together, for example,
Mhm.
because yeah, you have people who aren't able to effectively communicate with one another. You know, when you think about just, you know, unfortunately, throughout the world, people have experienced displacement and continue to experience it again and again,
Mhm.
and language is a huge part of feeling and the ability to integrate somewhere and just communicate. And so it's just the experience of, you know, as you know, you've had so many amazing people on your show, and the languages that exist, there are some languages that are similar, yes, but so many that are so different. So depending on where people end up, sometimes it's really hard to communicate for two people to be able to communicate when they don't speak the language. And so it really impacts the experience of people who end up being displaced and can be a huge differentiator for people if they are able to access a different register of language and convey meaning in any way
Yeah.
to another person.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. I think it also goes back to what we were talking about translation and, the access and being able
Yes.
to access that is, a, maybe even a completely different topic talking about access because who's allowed to have access and who's denied access. So,
Yes.
I love having these conversations truly because I feel just personally, I feel like we don't talk about language enough, even though we all use language in one form
Yeah.
or another. Some of us use multiple languages, but it's really, you know, communication is so much more important than I feel a lot of people even realize. And I don't think most people have to be obsessive about language or about communication, but we all use it to a degree and it all affects us to a degree,
Yes. Yes.
So it's like I don't know, I could talk about this forever. It feels
Yeah.
like, you know, um but I know that even with me doing this show and having an opportunity, I'm so grateful, to have spoken to so many people who care about their language, speak multiple languages, have, grown up around multiple languages like yourself. And I know that you've previously called it a superpower, a creative superpower. In your view, how has it changed your life or how has it affected your life in such a way? And maybe something that you maybe think about now that maybe you weren't thinking about then, and how has it enabled you to see this as a superpower?
So to your point earlier about language and how, you know, people might not seem to appreciate or talk about it much, right? I think it's because it's something we grow up with, right? When we grow up using it and we don't necessarily, it's just such a normal part of our lives that we don't even think about it. What does it mean? What does it not mean? And you know, sometimes people don't even really think about as much about words, right? Because the words we use could really change how things land. And so sometimes we think about it in the professional context, right? I must say it this way. This is going to
Right.
get me this result potentially
Right.
or not, right? But beyond that, I don't, you know, typically we don't necessarily spend as much time thinking about this thing that we use every day.
Mhm.
So yeah, I love one, your podcast and how you bring light to it. One one recent episode that I really appreciated was when you were speaking with a woman who was with an organization that actively tried to, or not tried to, but effectively kept a native language from phasing out, from dying out. And so the thought of people having to mobilize sometimes with just the way the world is shifting and languages die out, it takes concentrated effort to
Yeah.
keep certain languages alive. And again, we need the people to have the care and the foresight and want to and be able to put in the work to make those things happen.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm with you. It's really fascinating. But in terms of how I've my thoughts about language and being able to access different registers and languages have changed, and seeing it as a superpower. I also, yeah, growing up, you just take it for granted, or you just don't think about it, right? It's just these languages, you're able to speak them, and so it's convenient when you're traveling, for example, right? I remember the first time I went to a country where I couldn't really speak any of the languages. And it was funny enough, it was in Spain. And at
Mm.
the time, I was 14, I was in Mallorca. And even at the airport, they didn't even speak English. And I remember that was my first time, like, huh? Like, not even English. And I realized, oh, yeah, I guess there are parts in the world where that happens. But it was
Mhm.
my first time. And it just, I hadn't really experienced that before, because
Right.
typically I could find someone who would speak one of the languages that I at least
Right.
spoke. And but yeah, I think, in addition to the ease of it allows us to communicate with other people, right? We can make connections, have conversations with people, whereas people who might not know the same language are not able to have that same conversation. It helps us when we're traveling, or if someone on the street needs help, right, or directions. Um, but and then sometimes, as we know, like in Tobias Schiff's experience, it can mean a matter of life and death in certain circumstances. But beyond that, what I've learned also is that really the way we speak, or the way that we know how to put things into words, also shapes how we think, or how we think about framing things.
Yeah.
And so being able to access different ways of expressing yourself unlocks not necessarily, or not just different ways of seeing things based on how how you describe it, or how the language uses it, but also, yeah, how we choose to express ourselves. And so I know that we'd briefly talked about the example of, for example, "I miss you," right, which is like a common example, but I think one that illustrates this well, in how in English we say, "I miss you," and the focus is on me, because, yeah, I'm the one who's missing you. I'm experiencing this feeling of you being gone,
Mhm.
and this is how it's impacting me. And then when we think about in French, the words "tu me manques," when you translate that almost word for word, it means you are missing from me. And so while the translation for both is "I miss you," right? And it translated into French, "I miss you," but the way it's expressed is a little bit different. And so the focus is more on your absence, the gap that your absence leaves behind. And so it's these small nuances where it also shifts how we think about things, right? Oh, I really miss you. You're away from me. Um, or like, wow, you being away from me really leaves this absence that's painful, and therefore I'm feeling it. And so being able to access, and this is just a small example. I know that there are many languages, and I think about this often, right? I have younger siblings, and I have grandparents, and aunts, family members of different ages. And I know that in several languages, there's one word for younger sister or older cousin, for example.
Mhm.
And I think about those differences. We have to use several words to describe it. Oh, yeah, this person who's this, you explain a hierarchy. And
Yeah.
in the other languages, there's just one word and the other person immediately understands. And so I think it's really powerful, actually, when you think about it, that you have access to these and you understand how they work. And then how, if you're intentional about it, or you think about it, what are the ways in which you could bring this into another language or into another conversation?
Mhm.
We often don't think about it. We don't have to, but it's. I think it unlocks a lot in terms of how we think, and also how we view the world, and how we view things to be possible. Because language shapes a lot of that. Yeah.
Absolutely. Oh my goodness. It shapes what could be possible. Okay, the first thing, "tu me manques" rewired my brain completely.
Mm.
I grew up monolingual, so I didn't really even, as much as I wanted this is a longer story, I will tell you another time,
Okay,
but
because I want to hear it.
But I didn't really touch French in a formal way and like really learning it until I was in college. So I was like 21, yeah, 20, 21 years old. But even I didn't learn like tu me manques until I was much older and like listening to music and stuff, like Googling, what does this
Mm.
mean? And then I'd have a French speaker tell me what it means. But it's like understanding that completely rewired my brain and just changed the way that I think about a lot of stuff. And that was like the gateway because I'm like if this simple sentiment is said in French this way, what else? And
Yes.
what other languages can something be expressed better? And it's even to the point where I don't even want to say I miss you to someone anymore. I want to say you're missing from me, which in English
Yes.
doesn't have the same ring to it, but the sentiment I feel is just so much more powerful in French, in Italian, and the way, the way that it's said. Even as I'm asking you that question, I'm asking you that as a monolingual brain who is in front of a multilingual brain and just wanting to understand how the wiring is different. But I'm always so curious, like, what is it like? what do
Yeah.
you what do you experience? And not from a sense of like, you know, please, please, please tell me, it's not a place of desperation, but it's a place of just recognizing that my brain is not the same as someone who's multilingual and someone who's always had this environment, always grown up in this. And I think there's a lot that people, especially in the United States, as you said earlier, who want English to be the only language and the official language spoken here, I think there's a lot that people can learn by actually talking to people who speak more languages. If you can't go out and learn another language for yourself, fine, whatever. We all have constraints, right? But talk to somebody who has grown up in this normal environment, this in a normal multilingual environment, because the way that we both view the world is so differently, is so different. And we need to have more conversations like this and dialogue like this to understand the world better, I think.
Yes. Yes. I mean, at this point, are you still monolingual? Because I feel like you have so much knowledge and you've already learned several languages, and you're so actively engaging with other languages and the way that they're spoken and the people who speak them and the cultures behind them. I feel like your brain might have been rewired already.
I appreciate that. I really do. One of these days when we try to have a conversation in French, you'll see how monolingual I am. But no, I think I you're right. You're right. And I'm what I'm describing is, that condensed over the last 25 years really, because
Yes.
I did my few years of Italian. I lived in Italy for a little while. I've been learning French forever, for too damn long to not
It's a
even be
really
better
tough
at this. I
language.
know. But do I consider myself multilingual at this point? I mean, monolingual at this point? No. Um, but I know that was my brain for the first X amount of years of my life. And it like I said, that phrase really truly rewired me. But even before that, it's like coming to a point of actually thinking not just, okay, the words are different or the word order is different, but you can have a phrase in one language and sure you can say it in another language, but there's weight on one that the other
Yes.
doesn't carry. And it's being able to recognize that as somebody who did not grow up exposed in a natural environment, at home, on the street with friends and stuff like that, on the playground, has been like not only the joy of my life, but it's just been eye-opening. Like I wish that for everybody. I wish everybody would have an experience like that where they would just be able to get to a point of trying to communicate, even if you're failing, get to a point to try to communicate with someone in another language is
Yes.
like it's life-changing.
Yes. And I must say that I appreciate that you have turn this joy that you mentioned of that discovery for your life into something you share with others. So thank you for that
I
because
appreciate that.
you you could have and would have been okay if you went on this journey and for yourself and kept it to yourself. But I greatly appreciate that you're sharing it with the world and you're putting your content out for others to see and learn about different languages and not just the language but the culture behind it and the experience of people. So thank you so much for taking us along
Oh,
on this part of your journey. I was just gonna say also it's also interesting what you mentioned because I think as multilingual people, we don't multilingual people who grow up multilingual specifically, I should say, because when you grow up with it, you naturally pick up languages that you speak, either where you live or you go to school or in your household. And so I don't think as kids or even when we're young adults, you really think about it. It's just you speak these languages and maybe sometimes you'll have a moment where you want to say something and you're like, what are the words to say it in this language, right? Or like this doesn't hit the same if I'm saying it in this language. But I think we at least for myself, I never really thought about it as deeply, like what does it mean and what are the limitations of one to the other until I was older. Now I'm less mad at myself because also it's also easy to lose a language. And so, for example, I find myself, I'm in New York City. I'm speaking English the vast majority of the time. And even though French is my first language, if right now I turn around and have a conversation in French with somebody, I will be searching for my words a lot
mm,
because also one of the things is that in Belgium, people speak multiple languages. And so we will say one sentence using three different languages, and the other person completely understands it, right? And doesn't
right,
think about it, doesn't bat an eye. But
right.
what that ultimately results in is sometimes a word that you don't say often. Recently, I had to think of the word bridge in French. And I don't remember when the last time is I said bridge in French out loud, right? And I just couldn't come up with it. And I thought to myself, how? This is the language you were born and raised, speaking. You came into this world. Well, it's the first language I spoke after I came into this world, and I can't even come up with this word. But so sometimes these moments happen a lot, but I will say typically when you immerse yourself, it takes me 2 days back in Belgium or in a different country to not search for my words much anymore. But I think regardless, I find myself sometimes pausing and searching for words more. And that's also not just a language issue, but also the words we speak really matter, and it's important to be intentional with what you say because where we consider how the other person is going to receive it and how it's going to land. And so when it comes to that part, I think that's where I also truly value now the different ways in which things can be expressed to another person. So just like you say,
Yeah.
you'd rather, just like you said, you'd rather say you're missing from me than I miss you, right? Because you want the other person to know it's your absence that's hurting me.
Right.
Right? It's not just about me, it's about you not being here. That's the whole point. So we appreciate these things in life later, I think.
Yeah,
Once you
yeah,
recognize the impact.
definitely. Well, I really appreciated this chat of
Me too.
similar minds among multilingualism and literature and translation. Dani, please let us know where we can find the book and where it is available for purchase, and let us know how we can follow your work and where we can find you and keep in touch.
Thank you. Yes, so the book is titled Return to the Place I Never Left by Tobias Schiff. It's available anywhere books are sold. Bookshop.org is a great website if you're in the US because they donate a portion of all proceeds to local or indie bookstores. You can select your favorite bookstore that you'd like to support through bookshop.org. But anywhere, any bookstore can order it, or you can order it online. When it comes to where to find me online, you can find me at danijames.co. That's CO.
Amazing. I will share links to those in the show notes for this episode so that listeners who want to connect and get in touch will be able to click and do so right away.
Thank you. Yeah, get in touch with me. I'd love to hear from anyone who's interested in having a conversation or has any questions.
Thank you so much again for this conversation, Dani. I've had so much fun talking with you. I like to end each episode on the same question to have a little bit of fun. Do you have any
Yes.
jokes, popular sayings, tongue twisters, cool slang words, idioms, words of wisdom, or words of advice in Flemish or in French to share and to teach us?
Yes, I will share an expression that, you know how sometimes sayings and expressions don't quite translate as well, or
Yeah.
and some carry on across different languages,
Hmm.
and then others you wonder, where did this come from? And so there's one in Flemish
Uh-huh.
that says, in Flemish, you would say, de aap komt uit de mouw.
Hmm.
And what that means is the monkey comes out the sleeve, or the monkey emerges from the sleeve. Yeah, and what that means is the truth is coming to light, or the truth is
Oh.
being revealed. Yes, but for some reason we say the way to express that in a saying is the monkey coming out of a sleeve. And so I've thought about that. I actually should research it. Like what did that actually mean? Where did this come from?
Can I try it?
Yes,
Okay.
please.
I will repeat after you. Let's go syllable by syllable, and then we'll try to put it all together in the end. Wait,
Okay.
let me get a pencil because I like to fool myself that I have a better memory than I do, but I need to write stuff down. So, all right, I'm ready.
Okay, so it's pronounced in Flemish de,
Duh.
yes, which means the.
Mhm.
Aap,
Up.
yes, which is monkey.
Mm-hmm. Mm. De app
Komt,
komt.
yes.
Mm-hmm.
This is great already. Komt is coming.
Mm-hmm.
Uit,
At.
yeah. That was good. Which means out.
At.
And
Okay.
then another de,
De.
and then the last word is mouw.
Mao.
Oh, you're good.
De
The
app.
pronunciation is really good.
People have been telling me that, and I'm like, I'm very flattered. I'm very flattered. Maybe I should have tried my hand at music at some point. I never felt I was musically inclined, but people tell me I have an ear, so I don't know. Um,
Never too late.
it might be a little too late for me. De app komt out, out, out,
At,
uit,
at.
uit. De app komt uit de mouw.
Yes, that was good. And the at is very hard typically for English speakers. The or the those are some sounds that people typically they find a little tricky. So that's amazing.
Thank you for teaching me, teaching the audience how to pronounce that. We need to find
Thank
out the
you.
origins. When you find out, please come
Yes,
and let us know. Um,
yes.
let us know where that one comes from. But thank you so much again for this conversation. I've had such a blast chatting with you. This has been so
Me
much
too.
fun. Um, Before I let you go really quickly, if you've been talking to someone for quite a while, but now it's time for you to go your separate ways. Let's say in Antwerp, you're in Antwerp. You've been talking to someone for a while. Now it's time for you to go home, go your separate ways. Don't think about this too hard. What is the best way to say goodbye?
Uh, I know I'm thinking about this because when I was younger, by the
Uh-huh.
time I left Antwerp and moved back to New York, we said ciao.
Ciao.
So ciao is part of the Flemish, or was part of the Flemish lingo, and we would just say ciao.
Mhm.
Um, Now I don't know. I don't know if people still use that in Antwerp. I typically just say bye, but I would say dag, which means it means bye. It also means day.
Mm.
But I would just say dag tot de volgende keer, which means bye until next time.
Oh, okay. Die,
Dag, yeah, with
die,
the
die.
yeah.
And then what was the second part that you said?
Tot de volgende keer.
Tot de
Volgende.
volgende?
Yes, yes, yeah, you got it.
Tot de
Ke
volgende
keer.
keer.
Yes, you
Tot
got it.
de volgende keer.
Yeah, tot de
Dani.
volgende keer.
Oh my God. I got to work on speeding that up. I will work on speeding that up. Thank you so much for that. And I'll be talking to you soon.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. It was an honor. I had a great time chatting with you, and thanks again for highlighting your experiences with languages all over the world. So thank you for having me.
Thank you.
It was
Bye.
great. Bye.
New episodes of Speaking Tongues are available every Monday, 7 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and to like and share episodes with other language lovers like yourselves.